Have you ever stepped inside an old cabin in the Appalachian Mountains and felt like the walls were holding a memory you weren't supposed to know? Tonight we're diving into 10 of the most disturbing true Appalachian cabin horror stories, the kinds of encounters that will make you think twice about ever staying in one again. Before we start, hit that like button. Every like helps this story reach more horror fans just like you. And since every viewer here is part of my horror family, comment where you're watching from. And don't forget, your subscribe gives huge support to this channel and helps us keep bringing you terrifying stories every week. Now, turn down the lights. Let's step inside the cabin. I'd been needing a break from everything. Work, noise, the constant scrape of the city. A coworker had mentioned an old rental cabin outside Rennick, said it was simple, quiet, no cell service, cheap. That was exactly what I wanted. A long weekend to myself, just the sound of rain in the trees, maybe a fire in the stove at night, and nothing else. The road to the place didn't inspire confidence. Past Rennick, the blacktop narrowed until it was more patch than pavement. Then it broke into gravel, mud slicks, pooling in the ruts. The mountains pressed close. The hollow was tight, damp, and fog licked down from the ridges like smoke that couldn't lift. My tires cracked over fallen branches, scattering wet leaves, and the smell of rot hung in the air, sharp with pine sap. The cabin was one room, with a loft. Weathered gray boards, porch leaning like a tired shoulder. Inside, it smelled faintly of mildew and old wood smoke. The furniture was mismatched. An armchair with one arm collapsed inward, a kitchen table sticky with some old varnish, a sagging bed tucked against the wall. A wood stove stood near the center, ringed with soot stains on the floorboards. The silence pressed thick, broken only by a distant drip of rain off the eaves. I liked it. It felt tucked away, forgotten. The first evening passed quietly. I cooked a can of stew on the propane burner, drank 2 beers, read a little by lantern light. Around 9, the forest outside seemed to swell with sound, owls, wind shifting through black trees, then quiet again, deeper than before. I crawled into bed, the sheets smelling faintly of damp cotton. That's when I heard it. A soft creak of wood just outside, then another, slow, deliberate, like someone walking the deck. I froze, breath shallow, waiting for it to repeat. It did, 3 more steps, then silence. My first thought was a deer, maybe a bear nosing around, but the sound was too measured, not wandering, not aimless. It was the sound of boots on boards, pacing. I reached for the lantern, thumb shaking as I lit it. The warm glow spilled over the walls. The steps had stopped. For a long minute, nothing but my pulse in my ears. I forced myself up, crossed to the door, and pulled it open. The night was damp, cool, and silent. Mist hovered just above the ground. I leaned out with the lantern, light sweeping across the deck, empty. No movement, just the dark outline of trees pressing in. Then I looked down. The dew on the boards shone silver under the lantern, and there they were, boot prints, fresh, sharp-edged in the wet. They came from the far end of the deck and stopped right at my door. No prints leading away, just arriving, standing. I felt the back of my neck crawl. I shut the door hard, slid the flimsy latch across, and sat in the chair, lantern burning beside me. I told myself I'd misheard, misseen, but my eyes kept going back to that door, to the thin seam of night between the boards, waiting, listening. Sleep never came, only the sound of my own breath, shallow and uneven, filling the silence. By morning, the prints had vanished with the dew. The deck looked clean, washed pale by early sun. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined it all. Too much beer, too much quiet. But the uneasy weight in my chest stayed. I walked the perimeter of the cabin. The mud by the steps held no tracks, no scuff in the leaves or grass, just untouched ground. The prints I'd seen had been real. They'd just stopped existing beyond the deck. The day passed in a blur. I tried to distract myself, took a walk up the narrow trail behind the cabin, cooked, sat by the creek for a while. but every time the breeze rattled a branch or a squirrel darted through leaves, I jumped. That sense of being watched clung to me, the way damp air clings to skin. By sundown, I was already on edge, dreading the silence I knew was coming. That night, I left the lantern burning. I lay on the bed fully clothed, boots still on, staring at the ceiling. For a while, nothing but the wood popping faintly in the stove, then faint, muffled, the creak of a board outside. One step, then another. I held my breath, my eyes burned with the need to close, but I forced them open, fixed on the door. The steps drew closer. My pulse thudded in my throat, then suddenly, I couldn't stand it anymore. I rose, every movement stiff, and grabbed the lantern. My hand hovered at the latch. I told myself not to, but I opened the door. The night air felt colder than before, mist thicker. The deck stretched out empty, but the prints were there again, damp, new, pressed clean into the boards. They ended exactly where I stood. Only this time, a single droplet darkened the wood, just beyond the last print. Not water, darker, thicker. I bent closer before realizing it was blood. I slammed the door, heart hammering, and dragged the chair against it. The latch was flimsy. It wouldn't hold. I didn't sleep, didn't move. I just sat there, lantern burning down to nothing, waiting for another sound that never came. At first light, I left, packed nothing, just drove until the mountains thinned and cell signal returned. When I finally stopped, I sat in the car with my hands locked on the wheel, staring at them like they belonged to someone else. They wouldn't stop shaking. It's been months since that weekend. I've tried to explain it to myself 100 different ways. Tricks of light, the creaks of an old cabin, animals moving where I couldn't see. But I can still picture those prints in the dew, perfect and sharp, standing at my door, waiting. And what unsettles me most isn't that they arrived without leaving. It's that deep down, I think whoever made them is still out there, somewhere in those woods, standing silent, listening for the next door to open. I'd been restless for months before I decided on the cabin. Work, family, the constant churn of the same roads and same faces. I just needed space. A friend from high school, who still lived near Boone, told me about an old hunting cabin that hadn't been used much in recent years. His uncle owned it, tucked a few miles up a gravel road off the Blue Ridge Parkway. He said it was nothing fancy, but quiet, isolated. That was enough for me. The road up to it was narrow, the kind where trees closed in overhead until they knitted into a tunnel. Ruts caught my tires, and mud sprayed up over the fenders. It had rained the day before, and the hollows smelled heavy. Damp leaves, wet bark, the faint metallic tang of rusted tin roofs I glimpsed on old sheds. When I pulled up, the cabin looked exactly like what I'd pictured: gray wood siding weathered almost white, tin roof streaked with moss, a porch sagging under the weight of time. The first thing I noticed was the rocking chair. It sat at the far end of the porch, angled toward the trees. Its paint had long since peeled away, leaving raw wood gone soft with age. The seat sagged slightly, the runners worn shiny. Something about it seemed fitting, like the kind of detail a place like this needed. I figured I'd sit in it later with a beer and watch the woods. Inside was simple. One room, a loft overhead with a rope ladder, a wood stove squatting in the center. The air smelled of mildew and smoke, a dampness that clung to everything. Cobwebs sagged in corners, dust softened the furniture. There was a narrow cot, a table with 2 chairs, and an old gun rack on the wall that sat empty. I unpacked, built a small fire in the stove, and settled in as evening fell. That first night, the woods felt heavier than I'd expected. I sat on the cot, listening to the groan of the trees, the occasional drip of rainwater from the eaves, and the faint scrape of branches across the tin roof. When I finally turned out the lantern, the darkness pressed in like a weight. I don't remember falling asleep, just waking at some point to silence so thick it startled me. In the morning, when I stepped out onto the porch, I noticed the rocking chair. It wasn't where it had been. Instead of pointing into the trees, it now faced the gravel clearing, where I'd parked my truck. The shift was subtle but clear, the chair angled toward it, like someone had turned it deliberately. I figured it was wind, or maybe the boards of the porch were uneven. I brushed it off. The second night was colder, and the fog crept down from the ridge, swallowing the trees, until the cabin seemed like the last dry place in the world. I lay in the cot, listening again. The occasional snap of wood in the stove, a far-off screech of something I couldn't place, then quiet. When I stepped out in the morning, the rocking chair had turned again, same direction toward my truck. It unsettled me, though I tried to laugh it off. The wind, I told myself. The chair rocked lightly when I nudged it, the runners smooth enough, but something about the precision bothered me. Not random, always pointing toward the truck, always closer to straight on than the night before. By the third night, I couldn't shake the thought of it. The woods seemed to listen when I stepped outside, every sound pausing. The cabin groaned softly in its joints, as though resettling. I barely slept, waking every hour to check the porch through the small window. The chair stood still in the lantern light, shadow long across the boards, and yet when dawn broke, it had moved again, aligned perfectly with my truck. Watching, a knot had settled in my chest. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just an old chair in an old porch, but I couldn't deny the pattern. And deep down, I didn't believe it was the wind anymore. By the fourth day, I felt uneasy being outside. Every time I walked to the truck to grab something, I caught myself glancing back at the porch, at that chair. I started locking the cabin door at night, though the latch was barely more than a bent hook. I even thought about leaving early, but pride, or maybe stubbornness, kept me there. I didn't want to explain to anyone why I'd cut my weekend short. That evening, the fog rolled in thicker than before. It blurred the trees, until they were nothing but silhouettes, smudges of black against the gray. I stayed inside, lantern low, listening. The silence stretched long between sounds, until even the creak of the wood stove made me jump. At some point past midnight, I woke to a faint scrape outside. My stomach dropped. It wasn't the wind. It was softer, slower, like something dragging gently across the porch boards. I sat up, holding my breath, straining to hear. Then silence again. My skin prickled cold. I didn't go to the door. I stayed in bed, rigid, until the first faint light of morning came. When I stepped outside, the rocking chair faced the truck again, but now it had been pulled closer to the edge of the porch, nearer the steps, angled dead center, like it was leaning forward to see better. I swallowed hard and circled the truck. Nothing seemed touched, though the dew showed faint scuffs in the gravel, not footprints exactly, but disturbances, pressed stones, displaced in a way that made me think something had been there. Someone. I spent the day debating whether to leave, packed some of my gear, then unpacked it again. I kept telling myself it was just a chair, just my nerves. But I couldn't shake the image of someone sitting in it, shifting it each night, watching, always watching the truck. That night, I barely let the lantern go out. I sat in the corner chair by the table, facing the door, listening. My hand stayed near the hatchet I'd found, leaning in the corner. Hours dragged by, silence thick. No scrape, no sound at all. When morning came, I opened the door and froze. The rocking chair wasn't just angled toward the truck anymore. It had been dragged fully across the porch, positioned directly at the top of the steps. If someone had been sitting in it, they would have been staring down the clearing all night, facing my truck head-on, waiting. That was enough. I loaded the truck and left without eating, heart racing as I pulled onto the narrow gravel road. I didn't look back at the cabin. I couldn't. The image was already burned into me. It's been months now, but I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone up there. The chair didn't move itself, not like that. And what keeps me awake at night isn't the thought of someone watching my truck. It's the thought that they were waiting for me to come out, and that if I'd stayed one more night, I might have found the chair empty in the morning, because whoever had been sitting in it had finally decided to step down off the porch. I hadn't meant to stay there overnight. The cabin was supposed to be nothing more than a waypoint, a place to dry out, maybe warm up before pushing on in the morning. But when the storm hit, I didn't have a choice. It came down sudden and heavy, the way weather does in the high ridges near Spruce Knob. The clouds dropped so fast, it was like the mountain had been swallowed. Rain hammered the windshield, wipers useless, and the dirt road turned to mud beneath my tires. I nearly slid into a ditch before I found the pull-off. That's where I saw the cabin. It sat half hidden by spruce trees, slouching under decades of weather. Roof sagged, porch boards gone soft. No sign anyone had lived there in years. But it was shelter, and in that downpour that was all I needed. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and cold ash. The place had one room, cot in the corner, a table, a wood stove, and a row of empty shelves nailed into the wall. The floor groaned beneath every step, soft with rot in places. I lit the stub of a candle I'd found in my pack and set it on the table. Its glow threw long, thin shadows across the walls. The storm outside pressed against the cabin like a living thing. Wind howled through cracks in the siding. Rain drummed the roof until it felt like the boards might cave. That's when I saw it. Beneath the window frame, just above the sill, lines had been carved into the wood. I leaned closer, candlelight licking the edges. Letters, rough and jagged, gouged deep. The words were clear enough. Don't look outside when it rains. The letters still held curls of wood, pale and fresh. Whoever had written it hadn't done it long ago. I froze, candle in one hand, tracing the edges of the grooves with my eyes. There were no other markings anywhere in the room, just that one warning. For a long while, I sat on the cot, listening to the storm. The wind rattled the window panes, but I kept my eyes away from the glass. Every instinct told me to look, to check if someone was out there, some hiker leaving messages as a joke. But the words kept me still. The rain went on, hour after hour, until the world outside was nothing but blackness and water. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind felt pointed, directed, like the place itself was waiting for me to slip, to glance outside. By the time the candle burned low, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't leaving in the morning. I needed to understand who had left that message, and why. But beneath that decision, buried deeper, was something I didn't want to admit even to myself. I was afraid the warning hadn't been written for someone else. It had been written for me. The storm didn't break with the morning. If anything, it grew worse. The clouds dragged lower across the ridgeline, and sheets of rain blurred the trees until they melted into one another. I tried the truck anyway, but the road was nothing but churned mud. My tires spun and slid until I gave up and walked back to the cabin. Inside, the air was colder. Dampness crawled along the floorboards, seeping into my boots. I built a small fire in the stove from what dry wood I could find, but the smoke dragged slow through the flue, filling the air with the bitter tang of creosote. I couldn't stop looking at the carving. Don't look outside when it rains. The words had sunk into me overnight. I traced them with my fingers, feeling the rough gouges, imagining the hand that had met. Strong strokes, hurried, not casual. That's when I noticed something else. Along the sill, beneath the writing, faint scratches angled upward, parallel lines etched into the wood, not letters, marks, like fingernails, dragging desperately toward the glass. I pulled my hand back quick, heart thudding. For hours, I sat at the table, forcing myself to face the room instead of the window, my ears strained against the noise of the storm. The rain on the roof, the hiss of wind through cracks, and beneath it, faint but steady, the rhythm of water dripping onto wood. But it wasn't coming from inside. It was coming from the porch. I gripped the hatchet I'd brought with me, my palms slick. I thought about opening the door, about looking, But the warning pressed in on me, heavy as the storm. Instead, I slid the chair back against the wall and stayed put. The hours dragged. My candle died. The fire went out. The storm never lifted. At some point in the night, I woke to silence. For the first time in 2 days, the rain stopped. The absence of sound in the cabin feel hollow, gutted. I sat up slow, eyes adjusting to the dark. And that's when I realized something that froze me where I sat. The candle stub I'd left on the table was gone. In its place, balanced carefully on the wood, was a wet footprint, small, bare. My gaze snapped to the window. This time I couldn't help myself. My head turned before I could stop it. I looked. The glass was fogged from condensation, but streaked clear in places, like someone had been pressing their face to it, watching me sleep. I don't remember how long I sat there, staring at that window, until daylight finally came. The storm had moved on by morning, and the road had dried enough for me to leave. I didn't look back at the cabin when I pulled away. I didn't want to see if the window was still streaked with those shapes. It's been months since then, but I can't shake the memory of those words scratched into the sill, the raw curls of wood still clinging. I tell myself the storm made me see things. That exhaustion twisted it all, but sometimes when it rains now, I find myself avoiding windows. I'll catch myself turning off lights, so the glass won't reflect me, because I keep wondering. What if it wasn't a warning after all? What if it was an instruction? And what if, by breaking it, I've already invited something in? I wasn't looking for luxury, just a place to disappear for a few days. My uncle knew a guy who still owned a hunting cabin off an old fire road north of Marlinton. Said it hadn't been used in years, but it was dry, quiet, and free if I didn't mind roughing it. That sounded fine. I'd been needing quiet more than anything. The drive-in took longer than I expected. The road narrowed with each mile until it was barely more than 2 ruts climbing into the trees. Branches scraped the sides of my truck, and the fog rolled low through the hollow. By the time I pulled up, the place looked like it had been waiting for me. Small wood gone gray, roof slumping just a little, porch boards sagged, moss climbing the steps. Inside it smelled of old wood and mildew. Dust lay thick over everything. The single table, a narrow cot, shelves nailed unevenly to the wall. A few cans of food sat where someone had left them years back. Corn, beans, soup, all past expiration but sealed. I set down my own supplies and bolted the door behind me. The first evening passed quiet. I heated soup on the wood stove and ate by lantern light. The forest outside pressed close, silent, except for the occasional drip of water off the eaves. When I lay down, the cot creaked, and the smell of damp canvas filled my nose. I drifted off, uneasy but tired enough not to care. Morning was different. When I rolled out of bed, the first thing I saw was the cans. My food, the ones I'd stacked neatly in my pack, were standing on the floor in a small tower, 5 high, balanced clean. The rest sat in careful lines beside it. For a long moment I just stared. My first thought was that I'd done it and forgotten, but I hadn't. I'd been exhausted, sure, but I remembered zipping the pack shut before crawling into bed. I told myself it was a joke, some old trick of my uncle's friend maybe, or that the cabin had mice, though the arrangement was too neat, too deliberate. I shoved the cans back into the pack and laughed it off. The door was still bolted, windows locked from the inside. That evening, I checked everything twice before I lay down. Bolts, windows, even the empty gun rack by the door. I slept with the lantern burning low, and when I woke, the cans were stacked again. Higher this time, 7 high, leaning slightly, but still balanced. The laugh didn't come as easy that morning. The third night, I couldn't relax. I lay on the cot, listening to every sound, the stove ticking as it cooled, the wind brushing against the cabin, my own breathing loud in the stillness. My eyes kept drifting to the pack, to where I'd stowed the cans again. I kept picturing them shifting in the dark, rising into place. At some point, I must have dozed off. When I woke, the lantern had guttered out. The cabin was black. For a moment I lay still, listening. That's when I heard it. Faint, metallic, a soft clink, like metal tapping against metal. I forced myself to sit up, heart pounding. The sound came from the floor. I didn't move until the first pale light began seeping through the window. When I finally looked, the cans were there again, stacked in a perfect column in the middle of the room, 10 high this time. My breath caught in my throat. The stack swayed slightly, as though it had just been finished. I bolted out onto the porch. The morning air was wet and cold, fog pooling low over the trees. My truck sat just where I left it. No tracks in the mud, no sign anyone had been near. But the bolt on the door had still been set from the inside. That day, I barely ate. My appetite was gone, stomach clenched tight. I paced the cabin, checked the windows again and again. I searched every corner, even the space beneath the cot. Nothing, just dust and the smell of rot. When night fell, I stayed awake as long as I could, lantern burning bright. I set the cans out in plain sight this time, lined them along the wall. If something was happening, I wanted to see it. But exhaustion wins. It always does. I woke to silence so heavy it felt alive. The lantern was out again, though I'd trimmed it high. The air in the cabin smelled different, metallic, sharp. I sat up slow. Every can was stacked again, not in one column but in 3, perfect, even towers across the center of the room, and this time one had been placed on the cot, balanced carefully on the pillow beside my head. I didn't touch it. I didn't move. I sat there in the dark, shaking, until the first lull of dawn broke through the window. I left that morning without packing. Just grabbed my keys, yanked the door open, and didn't look back. The towers were still standing in the cabin, silent and waiting. It's been months since. I don't tell many people. It sounds like a bad dream, or something you'd make up to scare kids around a fire. But I can still see that last can on the pillow, balanced with a precision that made my chest go cold. I don't know how it got there. I don't know how any of it did. But I do know one thing. I never unbolted that door, not once. I'd been looking for quiet more than anything. Work had drained me. My apartment walls felt suffocating, and I hadn't been sleeping right. A rental cabin outside McDowell County seemed like a cheap solution. The listing promised seclusion. No neighbors, no traffic, just you and the mountain. That was enough. The drive down was rougher than I expected. The roads narrowed the deeper I went, winding through hollers where fog clung to the shoulders like it never planned to leave. Trees leaned over, their bare branches dripping from last night's rain. I passed a handful of trailers, then nothing at all. When I finally pulled up, the cabin sat crooked on its block foundation, the porch sagging like a tired jaw. Inside it smelled of dust and wet wood. The floor creaked with every step, and the wallpaper had peeled in yellow curls. There was one main room with a cot, a little kitchen corner, and a wood stove that looked older than me. The air carried that faint sourness of mildew, but at least it was dry. It wasn't until that evening that I noticed the book. On the table by the window sat a guest log. Its leather cover was cracked, the pages warped with age and dampness. I opened it without much thought, expecting notes from other renters, light comments, doodles, maybe a name or two from decades past. But as I flipped through, something caught me. Every entry, no matter the date or handwriting, ended the same way. He watched me sleep. At first I thought it was some running joke, a phrase passed along by renters as a kind of local tradition, but the tone didn't read as playful. The writing varied, some neat, some jagged, some written faintly as though the pen had been pressed too lightly, but each time the words closed the page like a quiet verdict. I set the log aside, unsettled, and tried to focus on my dinner. But when I lay down that night, the phrase echoed in my head. He watched me sleep. The words grew heavier in the silence. I woke twice in the night, heart pounding, though I didn't know why. The cabin was quiet, except for the wind moving through the trees. I stayed under the blanket, staring at the ceiling, until the faint gray of morning crept in. The log was still on the table. I flipped through it again in daylight. Dozens of names, each followed by the same closing line. My chest tightened with unease. Out of curiosity, or maybe something darker, I picked up the pen that sat beside it. I wrote my name in the empty space at the bottom of the page. I hesitated, then added nothing else. No joke, no closing phrase, just my name. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I wanted to break the pattern. Maybe I wanted to prove it was nothing. That night, I slept poorly again. The stillness of the cabin pressed in around me, too deep, too watchful. The next morning, I walked to the table, stomach tight. The guest log lay open just as I'd left it. I leaned closer. My name was still there, but a single line had been drawn through it. Dark, deliberate. I froze. My first thought was that I'd done it myself in the night, half asleep. But the line was too neat, too intentional. The pressure of the pen had cut deep into the paper, heavier than my usual hand. I checked the door latch, still bolted. The windows, too. Dust clung to the frames. No one had come in. But someone, or something, had crossed my name out. The hours crawled by. I paced the cabin, listening to the tick of the stove, the moan of wind against the boards. I couldn't shake the thought of that log. I told myself to leave, but something in me needed to understand, needed to know why every entry ended the same way. By late afternoon, I sat with the book again, reading page after page. The dates stretched back decades. Some ink faded to brown, but the message stayed the same. He watched me sleep. One entry stood out. The handwriting was rushed. The letters slanted. It ended with the phrase yes, but also a note crammed in the margin. Don't write your name. The air felt heavier after that. My hands trembled as I closed the log. That night, I couldn't bring myself to lie down. I sat in the chair by the stove, staring at the window. The candle flame wavered in the draft. My name pulsed in my head, the line that had crossed it out sharp and final. Somewhere in the early hours, I must have drifted. I woke with a jolt. The candle burned to nothing. The cabin was pitch black, and though I told myself it was just the wind, I swore I heard floorboards creak by the cot, a weight shifting slowly, deliberately. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat. I sat rigid in the chair until the faint light of dawn broke through. When I finally turned toward the cot, the blanket was rumpled. The pillow carried the faint indent of a head that hadn't been mine. I grabbed my bag and left without looking back. It's been months since then. I've told myself I imagined it. That exhaustion twisted everything. But I still see my name, blacked out with such certainty, whenever I close my eyes. And when I wake in the night now, heart racing, I catch myself staring at the dark corners of my room, waiting for the sound of floorboards shifting, for the weight of unseen eyes. Because I know, even here, far from that cabin, the phrase is true. He watched me sleep, and maybe still does. I needed to get away. Not because I had a plan, but because the apartment was a pressure cooker, and the city had begun to feel like a room where every corner had an accusation. My wife pressed a map into my hands and said, "Go someplace quiet," like it was an order that could be followed. I found a one-room cabin, a few miles off a rutted fire road above Tug Fork. Cheap, the owner said. No service most days. Folks like it for the quiet. That was the point. The road down into the hollow looked older than the truck I drove. Ruts, washouts, and tree limbs bowed like hands over the lane. Mist clung low in the holler, settling into dips and hollows like it didn't expect to leave. When I pulled up the cabin, sat low and squat between two stands of pines, shingles gone gray, porch sagging. The metal roof had the kind of rusted streaks I'd only ever seen in photos. Long, vertical, patient. Inside smelled like old smoke and damp blankets. One room, a cot, a short wood stove, a table with a single chair, a lantern hung from a peg. A thin window looked out over the clearing and the narrow strip of road where I'd parked my truck. I set my phone on the table, where the week no service banner flickered uselessly, and told my wife I'd be back Sunday. She said something about being careful. I shrugged and meant it. That night, the wind came down from the ridge, as if it had a memory. It rattled the tin and pushed rain in thin sheets against the glass. I called my wife around 8, because the quiet had a way of yawning open inside you and you felt small in it. We talked like people patching a fence, small things, work, a laugh about the neighbor's dog. Then, when the pause came, I said the thing I hadn't meant to say aloud, something raw and small that had been under my tongue for months. I don't know if I can stay, I told her. I keep snapping at you. I keep snapping at the kids. I'm tired, Jen. I'm tired of being the man who can't stop working. There was a long breath. Come home if you want, she said. We'll figure it out. Maybe. I said the word a stone I didn't know what to do with. We talked about trivial things for a few minutes more, then hung up. I put the phone face down on the table, the silence heavy enough to taste. Sometime past midnight, while the rain hammered and the wood stove popped, and the cabin sounded like an old animal, I heard something that didn't belong in the quiet, a soft static through the thin glass, like someone rubbing their thumb across a speaker. Then a voice on the wind warped, and coming from just beyond the porch. It repeated, clear as a bell, the exact words I'd said into my phone an hour earlier. I don't know if I can stay. I froze, hand on the table. The voice was thin with distance, but it matched my voice in tone and cadence. There was no echo to it, no melody of the woods, just that line, said again, as if someone had recorded it and pressed play outside. I wrestled with the obvious explanations. Maybe I'd blurted it into some walkie-talkie years ago and forgotten. Maybe someone had a scanner and was relaying cell calls out here for fun. But my truck, where the CB sat, was shut off and locked outside. I'd locked it when I carried the bag in. I had the keys beside the lantern. I checked them twice. Morning came in pale, wet light. The clearing smelled of crushed pine and old smoke. The truck was where I left it. The CB was dark and secured through the glass. No tracks in the mud, except my own. Still, that line circled in my head all day. I don't know if I can stay. It sounded like a confession wrapped in a threat. I told myself I had dreamed it, that the rain and the isolating hollow had conspired to replay my own words back at me. But that night, when the rain returned and the hollow filled with the long, patient sounds of the mountains, the radio crackle came again. This time it spoke another phrase I'd said that afternoon, the apology to my wife about the kids, the little pleading I hadn't intended anyone to hear. It said it word for word. There are noises that make a place feel inhabited. There are noises that make it feel observed. That repetition hollowed something out of me. I couldn't think of who would be sitting near my truck in the middling night, repeating my sentences into a dead radio. I couldn't think of why they would. The cabin's walls felt suddenly thin. Every creak outside made me look at the window. I didn't sleep much after that. I sat by the stove with a mug of coffee gone cold and watched the door. I told myself it was a trick of exhaustion or the storm, but the way the voice matched my words was too precise. It stopped being a curiosity and started to feel like an address. By the second night, I stopped pretending I could explain it. The repeating voice had a cadence that was mine, hesitation in the wrong place, a clipped end where I'd swallowed a syllable. Whoever was speaking knew the rhythm of my sentences the way a long-time listener knows the shape of a friend's laugh. That thought made the hollow feel smaller, like a circle closing. I put the keys back in my pocket and slept with my boots on. If someone came, I wanted the option to move without fumbling. The rain ground at the roof like a steady hand. Dark settled into the clefts of the pines. Around 1 in the morning, the crackle on the truck's radio began again. Not broadcast, not a conversation, just my voice plucked out of the dark and handed back to me through that thinned, electrical hiss. I keep snapping at you, the radio said. My fingers went ice cold. The sound came from outside, but it had a presence like it could be standing 20 feet away, or inside the hollow itself. I pulled on my jacket and eased the door open a hair, lantern light licking the porch. Fog had pooled in the low places, and the beams of the lantern looked thin and weak in it. The truck's silhouette was a darker cut against the gray. Its windows were fogged. The antenna leaned at a slight angle. I walked out without thinking, boots sinking into mud. No one moved. The air was still, the kind of still that makes your ears ring. The CB was switched off. I could see the radio through the dash glass, dark and inert. I put my palm on the hood and felt it vibrate faintly, like it was holding a heartbeat I couldn't perceive. Then a new line came from the static, and it was one I'd only said once, to my wife on the phone when my voice broke. I'd said, "I'm sorry, I can't be better." The radio repeated it with that same small trembling inflection. I walked around the truck, checking the tires, the gap beneath the doors. Nothing. No footprints but mine. The driver's side window was cracked an inch from the inside, small enough to have been opened from the outside without leaving the tracks you'd expect. My stomach knotted. I swore I felt a fingertip press along the glass, though nothing showed. Back inside the cabin, I double-checked the bolts on the door, the latch on the little kitchen window. My hand shook so hard the coffee sloshed. All night the radio chimed snippets, lines of my confessions, the small private arguments I'd had on the phone with my wife, a joke I'd meant to keep between us. The voice never answered. It only returned what I had already said. It never added a word. I tried to reason it out. Maybe there was an old scanner hitting stray cell traffic. Maybe someone in the hollow had a habit of recording and playing them back for reasons I couldn't fathom. Neither possibility made the hair on my arms stop standing up. There was intent implicit in the playback, a selection of phrases, a timing that matched the hours I had been honest and vulnerable. It felt less like a prank and more like surveillance. Dawn broke wet and low. I left the cabin without coffee, without my jacket, hugging a small pack of things and the terrible attention settling in my chest. I drove until the road turned smooth, until the trees thinned and the hollows opened into familiar strips of county road. I called home from a gas station payphone with a trembling hand. My wife answered. I told her I was coming back. She asked if I was all right. I lied. I said something about the weather and a restless night. Months later, I still think about the voice that repeated my prompt sentences. Not understanding it is worse than any explanation I could have conjured. If someone had been sitting by my truck with a scanner, who were they? A bored neighbor? A hunter? Or something more deliberate? Someone mapping the shape of my speech as if they were learning me line by line. There's one detail I can't stop returning to: the small crease on the driver's side window, a hairline smear that looked like a fingertip had pressed from the inside with care and then wiped away. I never saw prints in the mud, never found a fire or a tent near the clearing. The radio was never found active, and the truck had been locked. Yet the voice knew the private angles of my conversations, the apologies I hadn't meant out loud, the way my voice thinned when I said Jen's name. Somewhere in that hollow, someone listened. They had held my words close enough to repeat them back with the cadence of someone who'd heard me more than once. I imagine them now in my head, silent, patient, a small light, like a cigarette ember in the dark, learning the particular ways I fall apart. I sleep differently now. When my phone rings, I jump. When the car door closes outside my house at night, I watch the windows until the porch light goes cold. I find myself trimming what I say on a call, the way you cover a mirror when you don't want to see your own face. I've stopped leaving my truck keys where anyone could see them. The worst part isn't that I was observed. It's that someone else took those words and kept them. And that every time I hear a stranger's voice on a scratchy radio, or a night wind that sounds almost like speech, I wait for it to say something I thought no one would ever know. I still can't decide whether what listened that night was curious or cruel. What I do know is this: I said things into the dark of that hollow I never meant to say aloud, and some of them were taken and repeated back to me. I carry that echo like a bruise. It's a small chronic ache, A new thing I didn't have to begin with, and it wakes me sometimes in the dark, when the house is quiet and the world outside has the soft, patient hush of the Appalachian night. I'd hunted the ridges near Clingman's Dome before, but never this far out. A friend had told me about a half-forgotten cabin down one of the old fire roads. Hunter's Shelter, he called it. Though the way he said it felt more like warning than suggestion. I wasn't looking for comfort. I wanted a place to lay my head and keep dry. Nothing more. The road narrowed the deeper I went. Gravel gave way to rutted clay, slick with autumn rain. Fog drifted low across the hollow, clinging to the tree trunks like it had nowhere else to be. I could smell pine pitch and wet leaves through the cracked window of my truck, sharp as iron. When I finally saw the cabin, it appeared out of the gray sudden as a memory, slouched low, roof sagging. Porch bowed. The air inside was worse. Damp rot clung to the boards, sharp and sour, layered with old smoke. The floor creaked hollow under my boots. A cot sat in one corner, blanket folded but stiff with mildew. A rusted stove squatted in the center, its pipe half-choked with creosote. The shelves held a scattering of forgotten cans, labels peeled away by years of moisture. I set my gear down, tried not to breathe too deep. The smell carried something beyond rot, a wet metallic note, like rust left too long in rain. I told myself it was the nails bleeding through the roof. That night the forest fell quiet early. The wind eased, the owls gave a few calls and then nothing. The silence pressed in until every breath I took felt loud. I lay on the cot, jacket still zipped, listening to the occasional tick of water dripping down the stovepipe. Sometime after midnight, a new sound joined it. A slow, deliberate scrape, like something heavy shifting above me. At first I thought it was a branch dragged by the wind, but the rhythm was wrong, too steady. It moved across the roof from one end to the other, a dragging weight that groaned against the shingles. Then silence. Then another scrape, closer to where I lay. I held my breath, staring at the ceiling. My hand twitched toward the rifle leaning against the cot, though I had no idea what I'd do if something broke through the roof. Minutes passed. The scraping stopped. I must have drifted in and out after that, never fully asleep, heart hammering each time the old cabin sighed in its joints. By morning, the forest had returned to its usual rhythm. Distant woodpecker, drip of rain off the eaves, wind combing the spruce tops. The cabin looked the same, smelled the same. I almost convinced myself I'd dreamed it, until I stepped outside. The fog had lifted just enough to see the roof, and there, running in pairs across the damp shingles, were long, parallel grooves, shallow but clean, as if something heavy had crawled across the cabin in the night. I told myself it was nothing unusual. Shingles rot, weather scars them, raccoons and bears climb where they shouldn't. Still, the grooves stuck in my mind all day as I hiked the ridge, two neat lines, stretching from one edge of the roof to the other. Not claw marks, not bridges, lines. When I returned at dusk, the cabin looked smaller than before, hunched against the gray. The smell of damp rot met me at the door, stronger now, almost sweet. I checked the roof again from the clearing. The grooves caught the fading light, wet edges shining like wounds. That night, I sat awake longer, lantern burning low, my ears strained against the quiet. Around midnight, the sound returned. Scrape, drag, pause. It started near the far end of the roof, slow and deliberate, like weight being pulled. My throat tightened. The lantern flame quivered in the draft. I gripped the rifle and waited, each scrape closer than the last. Then it stopped directly above me. The silence after was worse than the sound itself, the kind of silence that feels aware. I sat rigid until my back ached, rifle barrel trembling in my hands. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under, but it wasn't sleep so much as surrender. At first light, I climbed the slope behind the cabin for a better view of the roof. More grooves had appeared, fresh ones. They overlapped the first set, deeper, crossing one another like something had circled and circled, until it wore a pattern into the shingles. The smell was worse too. Standing above the cabin, the air carried a sour tang, like wet iron mixed with rot. I covered my nose with my sleeve, stomach turning. That day I couldn't bring myself to hunt. I stayed close, pacing the clearing, watching the roof through the trees. By evening the clouds rolled low again, and with them came that pressure of silence. No birds, no wind, just waiting. I told myself I'd leave in the morning, that I could stick it out one more night, but when the dragging started again, heavier this time, I knew I'd made a mistake. The roof groaned with the weight of it. The grooves above me deepened, shingles cracking faintly. I stared at the ceiling, too afraid to move, afraid even to breathe. The sound circled the cabin slowly, scraping a path I could follow in my mind, round and round, closer to the center each time. Then silence. I sat in that silence, until the first gray light touched the window. When I finally stepped outside, the shingles were shredded, the grooves cut deep now, straight through the soft wood beneath. The roof looked flayed. My hand shook as I loaded my gear into the truck. I didn't look back until I was miles down the road, through the trees. Just for a moment, I caught a glimpse of the cabin roof glinting in the dawn light. The grooves from above traced inward in a spiral, as if something had been circling all night, dragging itself closer and closer to the center, to where I had been lying. I never went back for the rest of my gear. I never asked my friend about the cabin again, but some nights, when sleep won't come, I hear it, that slow scrape across shingles, the weight dragging itself closer, and I know the grooves on that roof are still there, marking the path of something that wanted inside, something that waited above me, while I tried not to breathe. I booked the cabin because it was cheap, remote, and promised no cell service. 3 things I thought I needed. The listing called it a restored off-grid writer's escape, tucked somewhere near the edge of an abandoned coal road outside War, West Virginia. Solar lighting, rain barrels, a wood stove, no distractions, no people. The drive-in should have been a warning. The road narrowed into a single lane, gravel washing out into red clay. The trees pressed close, wet with fog, branches arching over the truck so low they scraped against the roof. By the time I reached the cabin, my shoulders were knotted tight. It sat half hidden in a stand of hemlocks, boards weathered to a dull gray. The porch sagged, but the structure held. Inside smelled of damp wood, and something faintly metallic, like old nails bleeding rust through the boards. The floor creaked under each step, and the windows let in light the color of smoke. There wasn't much inside. A cot with a thin mattress, a wood stove squatting in the corner, and a dresser with swollen drawers that took effort to open. A guest log rested on the table by the window, its pages warped by moisture. Most entries were simple: dates, names, little notes about the weather or the peace and quiet. The first evening I unpacked and walked the clearing until the light fell. When I came back in, I lit a lantern and sat on the cot with a book, trying to settle into the silence. It was the kind of silence that made you think about the walls being thin, about the forest pressing close. I slept poorly, waking at every creak of the wood. The next morning, while shifting the dresser to get at an outlet behind it, something slipped from the back panel. A stack of Polaroids scattered onto the floor. I gathered them, thinking they'd be old photos of guests or maybe wildlife. But when I fanned them out under the light, my chest tightened. They were all grainy shots of the cabin's interior. Each one showed the same angle: the cot, someone lying asleep under the thin blanket, the faces blurred, but clearly human, taken at night. The hair on my arms prickled. I counted at least a dozen photos, different people, different years maybe, but always the same bed. The last photo in the stack stopped me cold. It was of me, the night before, same cot, same blanket pulled up to my chest, my head tilted in sleep. The lamp I'd left on the table was visible, casting the same dim glow I remembered as I drifted off. My mouth went dry. I dropped the photos and checked the latch on the door, still hooked from the inside. The windows locked, the frames swollen tight. I looked around the cabin, heart hammering, as if I'd catch someone still there. But there was nothing, only silence. That night, I barely lay down. I sat in the chair by the stove, lantern low, listening to the dark press against the windows. Every creak of the roof, every shift of the floor sounded like weight moving where it shouldn't. I didn't sleep, I just waited, watching that cot, wondering how someone had stood over me with a camera only hours before. The second morning, I woke stiff in the chair, lantern burned down to nothing. My body felt heavy, like I'd lost hours without realizing it. The Polaroids still lay scattered by the dresser, curling at the edges. I shoved them back into the crack behind the wood, and tried to convince myself it was some sick joke from years ago. Maybe a guest staged them, maybe someone left them to scare off renters. But the photo of me, the way the blanket creased exactly as I remembered, wouldn't let me off the hook. I packed half my gear, thinking I'd leave early, but pride or stubbornness kept me. I wanted to prove to myself it was nothing. I wanted daylight to burn the fear out. Instead, unease grew thicker. I noticed small things I'd missed, scuffs in the floorboards near the cot, as if someone had stood there often. A faint smell of film chemicals clung to the dresser drawer, and on the inside frame of the window above the bed, I found a fingerprint smudged into the dust. It was fresher than the rest. That night, exhaustion caught me again. I tried to sit up in the chair, but must have dozed. I woke to the sound of the floorboards shifting, not the casual pop of old wood, but a deliberate weight, moving from the wall toward the cot. My heart slammed. I didn't breathe. I forced myself to look, lantern guttering. The cot lay empty. I was in the chair, not the bed. The sound stopped in the middle of the room. Silence swelled back in, pressing hard. I don't know how long I sat frozen, eyes watering from straining, but when dawn came I found a new Polaroid on the table beside me. It showed me in the chair, slumped with my head against my chest, mouth slack in sleep. The lantern burned in the background, casting the same tired light. My hands shook so bad I could hardly pick it up. I didn't pack the rest of my things. I grabbed my keys and drove out on mud-slick roads until the trees thinned and the hollows opened. I didn't stop until I saw other houses, other people. I never reported it. What would I even say? That someone had been in that cabin, watching close enough to capture my sleep without waking me. It's been weeks, but I can't shake it. At night, when I close my eyes, I see that last Polaroid, the slouch of my body, the way the lantern light blurred, the knowledge that while I sat trying to outwait the silence, someone had been close enough to press a shutter. I keep wondering if there are more photos, tucked in places I didn't check, if somewhere there's a whole stack of them, cataloging me hour by hour, angle by angle, from the moment I arrived. And sometimes, when the house goes quiet and I wake to the dark, I feel sure of one thing. The last Polaroid wasn't the last at all. It was just the last one they left for me to find. I booked the cabin because it was cheap, close enough to town that I wouldn't feel completely stranded, but far enough that I could breathe without headlights or voices cutting through the night. It was outside War, West Virginia, tucked down a road so narrow the trees reached in like they wanted to scrape the paint off my truck. The cabin leaned a little to one side, gray boards soaked dark from years of rain. The porch sagged, its steps damp and spongy under my boots. Inside smelled like wet wood and ash that had never quite burned clean. Dust lay thick across the table. A thin mattress sat in the corner under a window swollen shut. It felt abandoned, even though the lock on the door worked fine and the owner had assured me others stayed here from time to time. That first night, I settled in with a lantern and a paperback. The forest outside hummed with insects, owls calling now and again. When the lantern dimmed and I lay down on the mattress, the silence pressed in. I could hear the faint trickle of water off the roof, the occasional shift of the boards under the cabin as they cooled. Then came something stranger, a sound, faint at first, like humming. Not music exactly, just a low, steady tone, human in rhythm. It came from the walls, deep and muffled, as though someone was leaning close on the other side. I sat up, pulse quickening. I listened hard. The sound carried only in short stretches, fading, then starting again. I checked the window, the door, both closed tight. The night outside was still, I told myself it was the wind working through cracks in the siding, or some animal nested between the walls, but lying back down, I couldn't shake the sense that the sound was deliberate, human. The second night, the humming returned. Louder this time, though never sharp. Always soft, low, like someone trying not to be noticed. It moved, from one wall to the next, sometimes behind the head of the mattress, sometimes near the stove. I pressed my ear to the boards, and for a second I swore I felt a faint vibration under the wood. Like breath, or the way a voice buzzes against your palm if you hold it to someone's mouth. Unease settled deep in my stomach. I tried to read to drown it out, but the words on the page blurred. Eventually I blew out the lantern and lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to that low, patient hum seep through the walls. When morning came, I searched. I ran my hands over the boards, checked under the bed, along the stovepipe. Nothing, just dust and damp wood. But near the base of the wall, I found one panel looser than the rest. Its nails sat crooked, head rusted. When I pressed, the board shifted slightly, revealing a dark seam. I didn't pry it open. Not yet, but I couldn't stop staring at it. And when the humming returned that night, soft and steady, I knew exactly where it was coming from. I didn't want to open the panel, that's the truth. Every instinct told me to leave it alone, to pack my bag and drive back down that coal road before the sun set. But curiosity is a kind of sickness. It eats at you until you're forced to act. That evening, I waited for the humming to begin. When it did, faint, pulsing behind the wall with that strange rhythm, I set the lantern low and worked the panel loose with the back of my knife. The nails squealed, flakes of wood falling onto the floor. The smell hit me first, damp, sour, laced with something sharp like old leather left too long in the rain. I lowered the lantern toward the gap. Dozens of small shapes filled the crawl space. Shoes, children's shoes. They were crammed tight, toe to heel, some leather, some canvas, all worn, all stank dark with years of damp. The laces were knotted, frayed. A few still bore the outline of stickers, the kind kids slap on their things. My hand shook as I reached in and touched one. The leather crumbled beneath my fingers. They'd been here a long time, too long. The humming had stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I shoved the panel back in place, hands slick, knits bending as I tried to press it shut. My stomach knotted tight, bile rising in my throat. I couldn't stop picturing the shoes lined in the dark, waiting. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair by the stove, lantern burning low, eyes fixed on that panel. Every so often I thought I heard something stir behind it, a faint scrape, a sigh of shifting leather. When dawn broke, I left. I didn't pack carefully. I threw my things in the bag, barely latched the door. The coal road was worse in the mud sucking at the tires, but I didn't stop until I saw pavement again. It's been weeks now, and I still can't put the memory away. The sound of that humming creeps into my head at night, low and steady, like someone behind a wall waiting to be found. I think about those shoes more than I want to, about how many there were, about who had put them there, and why, and about how the last row seemed newer than the rest, less weathered, like they hadn't been there as long. The image that wakes me isn't the shoes themselves, it's the gap between them, the dark seam I couldn't see into, where the lantern didn't reach, the place where I couldn't tell if the leather ended, and something else began. I'd taken on the cabin as a kind of project. My uncle had told me about it, an old place off a forgotten spur road near Black Birch Ridge, sitting empty since the late 90s. If you can get it back into shape, you're welcome to use it, he'd said. I liked the idea, a space of my own, somewhere quiet, away from the calls and the constant press of town. The road to it wound narrow through a hollow that never seemed to lift its fog. Pines leaned heavy over the track, their needles dripping, mud sucked at the tires. When I pulled up the first time, the cabin looked less like a structure and more like it had grown out of the hillside. Boards gray and swollen, porch sagging, roof mottled with moss. Inside smelled like mold and ash. The air was cool and damp, thick with that sourness that comes when wood rots slow. The floor groaned under my boots, and a thin layer of dust coated everything, but it wasn't beyond saving. I told myself that as I unlatched the windows and let the air in. The first week was nothing but small chores, scraping years of grime off the counters, clearing brush around the porch, patching holes in the roof with tar paper. Most evenings I sat with a lantern and a thermos of coffee, staring out at the hollow. It was quiet, deeply so. Sometimes I thought I could hear the mountain itself breathing, the distant crack of settling rock, the long sigh of wind. But every now and then, another smell would cut through the damp wood and pine, cigarette smoke. It was faint, just a trace, like someone walking past you in a crowd, but it didn't belong here. I hadn't seen a single person since I'd started working on the place. The nearest house was miles down the ridge road. The first few times I chalked it up to memory. I'd quit smoking years ago, and maybe the smell just lived in me. Still, it made me glance at the porch, at the trees beyond the clearing, the way they stood still, as though listening. One night, as I hammered loose siding back into place, the smoke came sharper. It clung in the air, until my eyes watered. I checked the porch, circled the cabin with my flashlight. Nothing but fog, and the drip of water through leaves. When I woke the next morning, the smell had thinned to nothing. But when I stepped outside with my coffee, my stomach dropped. On the porch railing, near the steps, lay the end of a cigarette, crushed into the damp wood, its ember still faintly warm. I hadn't smoked in years. I hadn't seen another person for miles. I should have left that morning, packed my tools, driven the rutted road out, and let the cabin rot. But leaving felt like admitting something was wrong, and I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I checked the clearing for footprints. Mud held the tracks of deer and raccoon, but nothing human. The porch boards bore no weight, except mine. The cigarette stub sat alone, gray ash clinging to the railing. All day I worked with my nerves tight. The smallest sounds, a branch snapping, a crow lifting from the trees, made me look up quick, hammer still in hand. The cigarette weighed heavy in my mind. Someone had been here, watching, maybe, close enough to leave something still burning. That night, I sat by the lantern longer than usual, listening. The silence pressed hard. No insects, no owls, just the tick of the stove cooling. Then, just past midnight, the smell returned. Stronger this time, like someone exhaling behind me. I turned, hard in my throat, but the room was empty. The smoke clung to the air, sharp and stale. I didn't sleep. I sat with the rifle across my knees, until the sky paled gray. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch. Another cigarette stub lay crushed on the railing, fresh. A thin wisp of smoke curled upward, before vanishing into the fog. I checked the road again, the trees, even crawled under the cabin with a flashlight. No tracks, no footprints, no sign of anyone bedding down nearby, only damp soil and the smell of rot. By the third morning, there were 3 stubs lined neat on the railing, as though someone wanted me to see them. My hand shook when I touched them. The filters were damp, frayed by teeth. I stopped working after that. I sat in the chair by the window, watching the porch, waiting for any flicker of movement. But nothing ever came. Only the smell at night, steady as breath, curling through the cracks in the walls. When I finally left, tools still scattered, the cabin half fixed. I didn't tell anyone. What was there to say? That someone had stood just outside for nights, close enough to leave smoke in the air. I breathed. That they'd never made a sound, never shown themselves. Weeks later, I can still smell it sometimes. Not always, just in quiet moments when I'm alone. The acrid curl of smoke, sharp and invasive, as if someone is leaning just out of sight. I keep thinking about those stubs on the railing. The way the last one was still warm when I touched it. Whoever left them hadn't just been there. They'd only just stepped away.